All right, no sleeping. I was talking to me, not you. So. All right. Okay, so evolution and the Big Bang are the major components of the story that naturalists believe explains our existence. And so evolution and the Big Bang are the primary parts of the naturalistic model. The scientific explanation of what has happened throughout history from a purely naturalistic perspective, without any supernatural help. Our model, our story of what happened historically and scientifically, the biblical creation model, is a little bit different, right? And so in the previous sessions, we've been laying out what that model entails. The biblical creation story, the framework that helps us to understand the universe around us, the physical evidence. And we looked at evidence for the existence of God last night, more specifically the God of the Bible, how you can come to know that He is the one God, and that the Bible really is His Word as compared to the other alleged holy books. And then this morning, we looked at the guts of what the Bible teaches us about history in those key areas that help us to make sense of the physical world around us. So the next question, can that model, as we have been studying it, that framework for viewing the evidence, can it explain the evidence from science and history? Does it harmonize with the evidence? Can it withstand scrutiny? Can the creation model be defended as we're told to, 1 Peter 3:15? And so in this session, in the session tomorrow morning, we want to tackle those questions. And again, if you have any kind of questions that you come up with that would be good for our Q&A tomorrow afternoon, be sure to be looking at that as well. So these sessions this afternoon and tomorrow morning will illuminate why the previous ones have been important to have clear in your minds, because they're going to help answer the criticisms that are being made in this day and age against biblical creation. Keeping in mind that a lot of the things I've talked about are very theoretical. The Bible doesn't say anything about catastrophic plate tectonics or an ice age, how the flood started, meteorite impacts. This is all us taking the physical evidence around us and drawing what we hope is rational conclusions, making sense of all that in light of what the Bible says happened. So notice it requires a lot of theory to figure out what's going on. And I hope you've seen that it's a pretty robust model, what I've laid out for you. It has a lot of explanatory power. It can explain a lot of evidence around us. It's not to say that we have all the answers sorted out yet, but we're on, I think, the right track. So, as we look at the attacks being made against creation, you're going to hear me several times point back to the model that I've laid out for you in these sessions and giving an answer to the charges being made. So in this session and the next, I want to spend some time responding to some of Bill Nye, the pseudoscience guy's attacks against biblical creation. So he squared off against Ken Ham several years ago now, it's been a few years, in a debate over biblical creation, specifically the biblical creation model. And so Ken Ham is the head honcho at Answers in Genesis, and who has developed the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter. Raise your hand if you've been to the Ark Encounter, several of you, okay? I highly recommend seeing that. I would agree with the science of 99% of that. When they get into doctrinal things, they kind of go off, but most of that is solid information. And I, in fact, lead tours for churches that want to go up there, where I walk you through both of those places and kind of give you some of the more detailed information about what they're portraying there. So in this debate, the first half of the first of all, raise your hand if you saw this debate. I'm curious. A couple of you did. The first half of the debate, I think, went fine. And as long as they were just presenting their kind of pre-prepared speeches. Ken Ham did fine. But once they opened it up to going back and forth, where you really see which model, if the biblical creation model can withstand scrutiny, that's where it went kind of south. Because Ken Ham just was not able to, I think, answer several of the things Bill Nye brought up. Although, ironically, the Answers in Genesis website does answer the questions Bill Nye brought up. But Ken Ham, he's more the spokesman for the group, but he's not really the one doing the science work behind the scenes. And so it made it look as though the creation model is not able to withstand scrutiny. That was kind of the unfortunate thing. So one of the points that Bill Nye brought up over and over and over several times, and by the way, I wrote a response to this in a pretty detailed article, which we have for free on the table, on the free part of the tables back there in the back, where I responded to a lot of these things that Bill Nye brought up, because I knew these are going to start becoming issues we got to deal with, because he made it seem as though we don't have answers to these. But one of the things that he brought up over and over had to do with predictions. So far, Mr. Ham and his worldview, the creation model, does not have this capability. It cannot make predictions and show results. The big thing I want from you, Mr. Ham, is can you come up with something that you can predict? Do you have a creation model that predicts something that will happen in nature? So notice the gauntlet's been thrown down here, and we have to be ready to defend the Bible, right? We're to be apologists. Now, he's not talking about predictive prophecy, okay? What he's saying is that in science, if you have a good theory, you should be able to make predictions. So let's say I say, I think that there's an invisible force like a magnet, and it will draw smaller masses towards the center of larger masses. And I'll just call this invisible force gravity. Okay. All right, so I can make a prediction. Now, if I'm right, then if I were to drop my remote, it should get pulled down to the earth because it's a much larger pull. It's a larger mass, so it should pull this towards the center of the earth. So I can make that prediction, go carry out experimentation that provides support for my theory. Now, if I drop this and it just floats, I've now falsified my theory, right? I've shown, so it's a lot easier to falsify a theory. If I drop it and it sticks to the ground, that doesn't necessarily prove my theory, but it does add support for it. So what he's saying is, you creationists can't do science, where you can make predictions and go out and do research and experimentation and actually do anything with it. That was his argument. So what I've already shown you is we have a model. It's very scientific. We've already looked at a lot of the evidence for that. Unfortunately, the bulk of the world around us does not realize that. In fact, there was a young man that just emailed me this week, and so he had a professor and that wanted him to write an article or an essay on evolution, and so the student said, well, can I write one against evolution? And so the professor went ahead and let him, but he said, but you need to use actual peer-reviewed sources. And so I gave him some peer-reviewed creation sources, and the guy wrote back, oh, well, those aren't peer-reviewed. Well, he's just ignorant. These guys don't know what creationists can do. It's all been suppressed. Well, anyway, hopefully you've already seen the creation model is loaded with solid science, but can it actually make predictions? I actually already mentioned some predictions that we've been able to make, but after watching that debate, I went ahead and sat down over about an hour and made a list of about 30 predictions that you would make based on the biblical model that have been verified upon going and examining the evidence. And I'm not going to have time to go through all of these. You can see that Reason and Revelation back there that is available for free, or go to our website. This article is online. So we're going to go ahead and jump to just some key ones that I wanted to highlight in this particular session. Several of these I cover in that other seminar, Dismantling Evolution, as well. I've got a Dinosaur Day event where it's really kind of targeting more of the younger people, where I show evidence for the coexistence of humans and dinosaurs. But let's look specifically at this number 11 here, or number 12, I should say. If the earth is relatively young, as the Bible indicates, and humans lived alongside dinosaurs, both having been created on day 6, then we'd predict that there'd be evidence that dinosaurs must have been around in the not too distant past. Okay? They didn't go extinct 65 million years ago, as the evolutionary community would say. Well, just as one example that supports what we would say on that, our predictions. In the past decade or so, a powerful evidence has come to light that verifies creationist predictions. Scientists have been cracking open dinosaur fossils that are supposed to be 65 to 250 million years old, and discovering collagen, blood vessels with red blood cells still intact, soft, stretchy tissue, where whenever you extend it and let it go, it pops back to its original position. In T-Rex, hadrosaurs, mosasaurs, psittacosaurus, a lot of the marine reptiles, even the pterosaurs, the flying marine or the flying reptiles. Now, obviously, these should have long ago decayed if evolution is true. Now, theoretically, collagen and hemoglobin could last undecayed for maybe thousands of years with pristine, cool, sterile conditions, which is not where we're finding these fossils, those kind of conditions. But even under those conditions, we're not talking millions of years. Amazingly, Mary Schweitzer was the one that originally found this. It's been probably a decade now. And she's no creationist. And she published this, and everybody, of course, the evolutionary community, tackled her on, no way, this is contamination. You've somehow gotten some flesh of your own or something in there, whatever. And she's like, all right, fair enough. She goes back and is even more meticulous to make sure, and found the same thing. Everybody else starts cracking open their own dinosaur fossils, and everybody's finding soft tissue. So like dozens of species have now been found with it. So now they're scrambling to figure out, how do you keep tissue from decaying for 65 million years? Okay, so you notice the blind faith here. I mean, it has to be. Evolution has to be true, and these have to be 65 million years old. Otherwise, God and the Bible are true. We're not going to believe that. That's hokey. But we're going to believe in this blind faith idea of 65 million years just so we can stay away from God? I mean, is this really just following the evidence where it leads? Or is this somebody that has dug their heels in and they won't accept the evidence no matter what? See, this debate has never been about the actual evidence. The evidence is clearly on the side of the Bible. The issue always comes down to, will a person accept the evidence or not? That's what it comes down to. Well, based on what they're finding, it should come as no surprise that carbon-14 is being discovered in dinosaur fossils. And there should be, we don't have the technology to detect carbon-14 in fossils that are supposed to be even 50,000 years old, much less 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, 4 million, 65 million, 100 million, 150, 250 million. We're finding carbon-14 in them that shouldn't be there. And it doesn't matter how much meticulousness is taken in order to make sure there hasn't been contamination. We're finding C14 throughout the entire geologic column exactly as creationists would predict. Again, verifies creationist predictions, what is now being found. Could talk a lot more about that. Let's move on. Number 13, if the earth is relatively young, remember we're doing predictions here that can then be carried out science, we can figure it out, find whether the science actually supports our model. We would predict that geologic processes that have been assumed to take eons by conventional methods, like petrification, we would assume that there'd be evidence found to show that these processes can actually form rapidly. And of course, more and more scientific evidence has come to light that verifies creationist predictions. For example, back in 2004, this is just one example, this has been done other times, 5 Japanese scientists published their research on rapid petrification in the secular journal Sedimentary Geology. So they were studying mineral-rich acidic water from the explosion crater of the Tateyama volcano in central Japan. So water flows over the roof of the edge of this volcano as a waterfall, and they saw that some wood had fallen in the path of this mineral-rich water, and they realized that wood petrified within 36 years. And so now they wanted to conduct some, more specific controlled experiments, and they put wood down in the water and tested to see how long it would take. They found that silica petrification could occur in 7 years In 2004, a paper was published on rapid silicification of plants at Yellowstone, and they found within 11 months, the plants were already found to have had enough silicification that the plant tissues had been stabilized against collapse and the plant structure was replicated. And so again, notice though, you need to have special conditions that would be from catastrophic events like volcanoes. If you have that kind of condition, it can rapidly petrify things. And of course, we would say that's exactly what would have been the case in the flood. Coal, oil, and diamonds are thought to have taken millions of years to form, but scientists now know they don't necessarily take a long time because we can form it in a laboratory in a matter of minutes in the case of coal, hours, days, with heat being the primary requirement. Volcanic clay accelerates the process along with moderate pressure, both of which would be in the flood. The 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens verified the fact that catastrophic activity can rapidly create the environment for rapid coal production. And the modern flood model, again, would have likely brought about the perfect circumstances. With oil as well, scientists have discovered it doesn't take millions of years to form. It can be formed rapidly in labs, and we see it being formed rapidly in nature. The Guaymas Basin, for example, one of the trenches in the Gulf of California, has a 1,500-foot thick layer of material that's been deposited by billions of tiny organisms, and as hot geothermal waters move through that ooze, it is being converted to oil and natural gas. Diamonds are thought to be millions of years old, but scientists are regularly discovering carbon-14 in diamonds, proving that they can't even be 50,000 years old. And so diamonds aren't as old as they have always thought. So something happened within the last few thousand years that had to speed up decay rates over a period of time, aging things rapidly and making them look older than they really are in some cases. Diamonds are thousands, not millions of years. Number 14, again, if the Earth is relatively young, we would predict evidence to be uncovered indicating the layers of the geologic column can be deposited rapidly, that the sediment can be deposited and then lithified, turned to stone rapidly. And just one such example comes from what are called polystrate fossils. These are fossils that cut across multiple polystrata, straight. So like, for example, this tree or this one. So if those layers take millions of years to be deposited and then lithified, what would you be having to say? Okay, this tree is sticking up out of the ground and somehow it's still alive while all this material over hundreds of thousands and millions of years. Does that happen? Do you know of trees that are hundreds of thousands of years old sticking up out of the ground? No, they would die and they wouldn't even fossilize. Because whenever things die, what happens if you kill an animal on the side of the road? It doesn't fossilize. It gets eaten by scavengers and so forth. It gets destroyed. It takes special circumstances to even make a fossil. In fact, it takes catastrophic conditions to do that. You got to bury it quickly and deep. Keep it away from oxygen and large amounts of water so that it can stay there and get compact. And gradually the water, as it's seeping down to it, is replacing the decayed parts slowly over time, and it turns it into rock. So it's got to be very sequestered from any of those kinds of things that'll accelerate decay. So trees have been found as polystrate fossils, and in fact these fragile plants called calamites and catfish. This is probably the most famous. An 80-foot long baleen whale standing on end in a diatomaceous earth core in California. Just one example of a polystrate fossil refutes the claim that sediments take millions of years to lithify. By the way, let me give you another quick example. Whenever you go, for example, to Grand Canyon, if you go into Carbon Canyon, there is this deposit of sediment that is, I don't even know how tall it is. It has to be hundreds of feet in height. And you see these distinguishable layers. All of a sudden, they turn 90 degrees and start going up into the sky. Okay, now what happens to a rock if you try to bend it? It's going to break, okay? So if you have rock strata that are bent without breaking, that tells you that those strata had to have been deposited rapidly, and before they lithified, there had to have been rapid, like the tectonic plates rising to force it to turn like that. Okay, and before it then lithified. All right, now that would be catastrophic. That means all that material is deposited rapidly. It's still soft, and then tectonic activity moved so fast that it turned it. Well, at Grand Canyon, you see that. At Carbon Canyon, you've got that. I've got some pictures of that. And now the secular guys say, well, it has to be that it was laid down flat, and then the tectonic activity kind of reheated it so that it could bend. And then, okay, well, if it does that, it becomes metamorphic rock. It's a different kind of rock. Okay, so the question is that sedimentary rock at Carbon Canyon, or is it metamorphic? And the answer to that is huge. Okay, so one of the answers in Genesis guys, one of the PhD geologists, he was going to go down to Grand Canyon, take samples, and prove that's sedimentary rock. They wouldn't let him. So the answers in Genesis sued and won. And so he got to go down there, get the samples, and prove it's sedimentary rock, exactly as we'd predict it would be. This isn't metamorphic. This was all deposited. The whole geologic column was deposited rapidly. That's just one example. You see these sedimentary. In fact, last year I was in some caves in Virginia, studying the caves there, and I saw folded strata in the cave that's sedimentary rock. So this is all over the world, that kind of evidence. Number 15. Secular geologists argue that uniformitarianism is true, although again there's some movement away from strict uniformitarianism, but evolutionary dating methods, all of them are based on the assumption of uniformitarianism. Whatever rate you see going on today has always been that way in the past. And there's a bunch of these examples, but they all come down to that basic principle. So according to uniformitarianism, processes going on today have always gone on in the past that way. So if a stream is moving down through a canyon, like say the Grand Canyon, you got the Colorado River moving down. It's always moved that way, according to uniformitarianism. It's always moved that way and in the same basic way. But if the creation model is true, we'd predict that canyons can form rapidly, and evidence, in fact, substantiates that prediction. For example, March 19, 1982, a small eruption at the summit of Mount St. Helens caused a massive mud flow, and within one day, a 20-mile-long, 140-foot deep canyon was carved. This completely nullifies uniformitarianism. If uniformitarianism is true, and geologists come along and they see this little stream going through there, well, hey, they're going to assume it's always been doing that throughout time. And so therefore it would have taken tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years for this canyon to form. And yet we know it was formed in one day. You just need to have catastrophic conditions, as would be the case in the flood. I mentioned to you the Lake Missoula flood, which was actually from, we would say, the ice age. They would say from one of the ice age. Water breached an ice dam and released 500 cubic miles of water, 10 times the combined flow of all the rivers in the world, released in 2 days. It destroyed 16,000 square miles of terrain, cut hundreds of feet through solid rock, created canyons. Number 16, if the Earth is relatively young, but evolutionary dating methods say it's old, then we'd predict evidence to come forth that indicates there's something wrong with these dating methods. They must have flawed assumptions. And that evidence is becoming more and more readily available as well. So these evolutionary dating methods are based on at least 3 fundamental assumptions that have major problems when you look at the actual empirical evidence. And I could spend a lot of time on this, and in my evolution seminar I do spend more time on this. The book, The Young Earth, that we sell, which I brought one copy if it hadn't been purchased, I would recommend. It goes into a lot of the issues with these dating methods, and I talk about these in articles on our website as well. But for the sake of time, let's just look at one of these assumptions. Okay, so one of the assumptions is that if you have, say, a rock that is uranium, okay, it's a rock made out of uranium, it decays into lead, okay, lead-206 over time. Uranium decays into lead. And so if you find a rock and it has some uranium and some lead in it, what they do is figure out how long does it take for uranium to turn into lead, and then they just backtrack to figure out how long it would have taken for it to be completely uranium. Okay? That's basically what they're doing. And so there's a lot of assumptions that go into that, but one of them is that the nuclear decay rate, for example, of uranium into lead has stayed constant throughout history, okay? That's one of the assumptions. Now, in 2009, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, this is where the Large Hadron Collider is that discovered the Higgs boson particle. You might have remembered that from years ago, the God particle. They announced research that indicates that the nuclear decay rates are not, in fact, always constant. If you have ultrasonic cavitation in water, it increased the decay rate of thorium-228 by a factor of 10,000. Ultrasonic cavitation in water is the flood. Okay, there's going to be a lot of that going on. So when you have these weird catastrophic conditions, it can mess with these decay rates and therefore make things look a lot older than they really are. Okay, you can accelerate these decay rates, and they're assuming that they're constant. In 2010, Purdue research, they released, they discovered that radioactive decay rates on Earth apparently are affected by what's going on in the sun. When things happen in the sun, it seems to affect the decay rates over here. So notice, without this fundamental assumption of constant nuclear decay in place, you can't use these dating techniques. You can't date anything that's thought to be very old because there's no way the assumptions would hold. So again, the creation model predicted that this kind of thing would be found. Science has confirmed it. Number 17, if the Bible indicates the earth is relatively young, the creation model would predict evidence of that claim would surface, keeping in mind also that we would also predict a mature earth. Right? The universe is going to look old for the most part, but we would expect there to be some evidences of a young earth. Well, sure enough, we've got lots of lines. I've got an article called 21 Reasons to Believe the Earth is Young, where I'll go into a lot of this, but let's just look at a couple quick examples. The moon is receding from the Earth at a rate of about 4 centimeters per year at present. It's not a linear rate, so when it's closer to the Earth, the recession was faster, and it's slowing down now as it moves further away. So based on the equation that describes the recession rate, scientists can calculate where the moon would have been compared to the Earth at different times. So we know, for example, 6,000 years ago, the moon would have been about 800 feet closer to the Earth than it is today, with some assumptions in place. Right? Always keep your assumptions in mind. That would be fine, though. It's not a problem. But if the moon is as old as they say it is, they claim the moon is 4.5 billion years old. 1.5 billion years ago, the moon would have actually been touching the Earth. Okay? So it would be physically impossible for it to be any older than that. Okay, so how would they ever respond to that? Well, they'd have to say, well, the recession rate was different in the past. Yeah. They've now given up on uniformitarianism. Right? All of their dating methods are based on the assumption the decay rates have been the same. So anytime it's inconvenient, I'll see them say, well, yeah, okay, it must have been different in the past. And then they give up on uniformitarianism, unless it sticks with their dogma, okay? Bottom line, the moon can't be as old as they claim using their own assumptions. What I would say is, this doesn't actually prove a young moon. What this proves is uniformitarianism is garbage. Get rid of it. The minute you eliminate uniformitarianism, granted, you can hardly date anything except through divine revelation. You can't really use science to prove a young earth. You can't do it. The assumptions prohibit it. The only way to know the age of the earth is if God weighs in on the subject. Now, you can find evidence to support what you believe, but it's still going to be based on certain assumptions. Here's another example. In the area of population statistics. So evolutionists believe humans have been on the earth for 2 to 3 million years. The genus Homo, okay? Homo erectus and Homo heidelbergensis and the Homo diminuti and the Cro-Magnons and the Neanderthals. These are all the Homo group. So using statistical equations, you can get an estimate of how many people should be on the earth if that were true, okay? So if we given conservative estimates and we account for disease, war, famine, and so forth, if we assume humans have only been on the earth for, let's say, 1 million rather than 2 to 3 million years, there should be 10 to the 2,000th people on the earth today. Okay, that's a lot of people, okay? Now, in order to try to get your mind around that number, if the universe is, say it's only 28 billion light years in diameter, they're actually saying it's now bigger than that. Well, let's just stick with 28 billion light years. If you took miniature humans, 3 feet tall, with narrow shoulders, and squeezed them into the universe like sardines, you could squeeze 10 to the 82nd power people into the whole universe. Now notice that leaves a few more humans. In fact, enough humans to completely pack 10 to the 1,918 other universes like ours. Completely fill them. And remember, these are calculations based on humans just being around for 1 million years, not 2 to 3. Okay, so it'd be argued, I'm sure, well, there just couldn't be that many people. There wouldn't be enough resources. And so all those extra people would just die off somewhere around 50 billion, which is what they would say the Earth's capacity is. Okay, well then there should be, we can make predictions, there should be evidence that that capacity has been reached long ago multiple times, and billions upon billion years of hominid fossils should prove that. And yet, according to their own words, they barely have enough to fill one coffin. According to their own words on this. Okay, it's just not reasonable, the mathematical gymnastics that have to be done to try to make sense of this. Now, amazingly, if we adjust our calculations based on our assumption, the contention that creation is true, we'd argue that about 4,350 years ago, 6 people began the repopulation of the earth, if you eliminate Noah and his wife. And if that's the case, 6.7 to 8.1 billion people should be on the planet today. That's very close. Another example, scientists have been measuring the Earth's magnetic field with precision since 1835. And they've determined that the Earth's magnetic field is decaying, and it even has a half-life of 1,100 years. Now again, if we take their own assumptions, uniformitarianism, and we calculate back in time and we double the Earth's magnetic field every 1,100 years, you get to a point 30,000 years ago when the Earth's magnetic field would have been so strong that it would have been comparable to a neutron star, creating so much heat that it would have been catastrophic to the Earth. Earth's internal structure probably couldn't have even sustained the heat. It'd be impossible for life to exist, and yet evolutionists say life has been around for not 30,000 years, but 3.8 billion years. Okay, now again, if the creation model is true, there's no problem to dodge here. And so there's a bunch of scientific techniques like this using their own assumption of uniformitarianism that demand a young Earth. And so which one is true? Well, the answer is you can't use any of those methods. Uniformitarianism is a terrible assumption. So get rid of all of it, and you're going to have to study the Bible and see what the Bible says about this. That's ultimately what you have to do. Number 18, evolution predicts life has evolved into more complex forms. Intelligence has gradually increased over time, starting with a single-celled organism, ending with the state of consciousness that humans enjoy. And so ancient man is depicted as dumb cavemen grunting and beating clubs and with their knuckles dragging on the ground, which does describe a lot of men today. But they're incapable of intelligent thought, and only developing more sophisticated technology as our brain finally develops and allows us to. Now, the creation model would predict, if you think about it, the opposite, okay? Because God made man fully formed and perfect. His brain and his brain power, his genes were in pristine condition, no genetic defect. His ability to think and focus and reason no doubt exceeded our own. So man before the flood could have been capable of who knows what. Because humans not only had that kind of power in their mind and even in their physical bodies, but they're living 900 years. Imagine what you could do if whatever craft you study for 50 years, you multiplied that by, say, 30 more lifetimes. How great you would be. And who knows what they were able to do? It was all totally obliterated in the flood. We can't even study it. The only things that survived came through Noah and his family, and you do see evidence of the amazing technology through their family. We'll look at that later. So again, the Bible verifies in Genesis 4, humans are already extremely intelligent, making cities right off the bat at the time of Adam's grandson. As apparently during the lifetime of Adam, men are already using tents, having livestock, designing musical instruments, and even working with bronze and iron, remember. So these are thought to have taken hundreds of thousands of years to develop from an evolutionary sense. So the evolutionary model would predict this increase in human advancement and intelligence as we become more enlightened, right, more evolved. But we would predict advancement doesn't really have to do with our intellect or intelligence. I mean, entropy is going to play a role. So as the human genome continues to degenerate, our bodies and brains are not going to be capable of doing what they would have been able to do 6,000 years ago. So in a sense, there'd probably be a decline in various aspects. We're not living as long too. But also number two, we'd predict that human advancement has to do very much with the state of a society, okay? So the decisions that its leaders are making, okay? Does the society create an atmosphere that encourages using our God-given abilities, learning, research, exploration? So how free is this society to do the things, to unleash their potential as God gave them? And of course, if that society, is it behaving in a way that grants it providential blessings from God? See, we would have to work that in, which the secular guys, of course, wouldn't. But God blesses nations whose God He is of theirs, right? Proverbs 33:12, right? Or Psalm 33:12. So advancement we would expect to be up and down, different levels throughout history, depending upon the society, okay, and how well they're doing, especially spiritually. So then when a society ultimately becomes so wicked that it collapses, which is inevitable, then you'd expect a lot of that advancement that they have to just come to an abrupt halt and many times disappear. And so sure enough, archaeologists dig around and we find amazing things from societies in the past that we didn't even know how they can do it. And yet those societies are buried, and guess who's living on top of them? Many times third world countries. They're living at the very place where people before them had technology way more advanced than they did. What does that tell you? This doesn't have to do with intelligence. Why was that nation below them wiped out? Well, the Bible always tells you what it is. He'll wipe them out where they become a byword. They'll be forgotten. Nobody will even remember they're there. Archaeologists dig down, they're like, wow, we didn't even know these people existed. Right? That's a biblical concept. That doesn't make as much sense from an evolutionary perspective. But archaeologists will dig down and find architecture and structures and technology that are mystery as to how the ancients knew about these. So we found examples of this all over the world. Advanced ancient human intelligence, ancient boats able to hold lots of people, very precise maps that give accurate depictions of the shape and size of coasts and so forth. Advanced astronomy, even though they didn't have the telescopes we have, the tools that we have, chemistry, advanced chemistry, hydraulic engineering, weaponry. There's solid evidence that the Nazcan people of Peru from 2,000 years ago, they were already able to perform successful skull surgery to relieve pressure from battle wounds. And one of the reasons we know that, we find evidence that the skull had been opened up and then it was replaced and it started growing back. Okay, and so they were able to do successful skull surgery. They built a sophisticated system of aqueducts, many of which are still functioning today, 2,000 years later, called puquillos. And so we find ancient towers and ziggurats, pyramids all over the world, abilities which societies had, and then the technology again disappeared with the collapse of that society, only to be uncovered by archaeologists hundreds or thousands of years later. This is what we would expect. And this is what we find. And interestingly, these are one of the examples of the kind of technological ability that seems to have survived the flood through Noah and his family. So if you think about the kind of things they were studying in order to build the ark, it comes down to things like civil engineering and marine type engineering. And we find evidence of that immediately after the flood. The Nazcan people, again flourishing 2,000 years ago, were drawing these enormous, very precise pictures called geoglyphs on the ground. These are actually featured in the fourth Indiana Jones movie. And these pictures are so enormous that many of them were not even discovered until we could fly over them. See, these are roads. It shows you how big these are. These huge geoglyphs that span for long distance. Some people have theorized that maybe they had the ability to do hot air balloons because we found that they had what appears to be threads that were so finely sewn together that they're even closer than our parachutes are today. So they've wondered, is that what because why would you make these if nobody can actually see them unless you're above the ground? Or maybe they're trying to talk to the gods or something, but they're being able to do it. In the 1930s, archaeologists discovered ancient batteries, proving that people in Baghdad knew how to make these over 2,000 years ago, 250 BC. 2006, the New York Times ran a piece announcing the discovery of ancient Peruvian canals used for irrigation farming. And these are thought to go all the way back to Abraham or before. And here's what Craig Morris of the American Museum of Natural History said. Their use of slope and management of water flow shows again that ancient people were a lot smarter and more observant than we often give them credit for. Again, because they're thinking evolutionarily. Okay? Humans have always been intelligent. And again, the creation model would predict that would have always been the case, even in ancient times. And by the way, it's true that we have a lot of advanced technology today, okay? And that can be confusing to you and make you think, oh, well, that means that humans have become smarter. It's not really what's going on if you think about it. But when you consider the primary discoveries that spark technological progress, think about, for example, the discovery of how to harness electricity. The telephone, has the telephone been important? You think about how many things have come from that. The internal combustion engine, airplanes, computers, the sparks that begin these processes, in general, come down to individuals who either accidentally stumbled across a discovery or designed something after many, many trials and errors. It wasn't about them being, like, say, more evolved or something. They would use, a lot of times, stumble across something. Now, and you got to ask questions. Well, how did they have the time and money to keep working on something over and over and over and failing until they finally come up with something? That has to do with the society they're living in. If the society grants them freedom to be able to explore those kind of things. If you were to live in a society where they tell you what you're going to do, it's going to hold you back from making the kind of progress that your society would otherwise do. When you take freedom away, the society's not going to do as well. So it doesn't have to do with intelligence. Now, after you discover something, after humans figure something out, we're really good on building on that discovery, inventing new things, and going high, especially when you consider the minute the ability to communicate over long distances was made, after we figured that out, where now we can coordinate with people across the world and so forth very quickly, and scientists can work on each other's stuff and improve. Well, that changed everything. But how was the telephone figured out? That's the key. Right? That was a single thing where God can providentially just make something happen for a country that allows a boom. And it has nothing to do with our intelligence. If anything, you would say it had to do maybe with that individual being somebody, or that society around them being somebody that God wanted to bless in some way providentially. Imagine if the pre-flood world had stumbled across, say, electricity. Who knows what they may have been capable of doing to build on that knowledge when you consider how long they lived. I've often jokingly said, imagine we get to Mars and we step off the spaceship and we find that humans have already been there, right? From the pre-flood world, right? All right, number 19. I'm just joking on it. Don't quote me on that. All right, since the Bible mentions giant humans, we'd predict there'd be evidence surfaced that supports that claim, that giant humans have lived. So are giants a mythical idea? Apparently not, according to evolutionists. According to evolutionists. The popular science podcast, The Naked Scientists, yes, that's their name, that's put out by Cambridge University. They conducted an interview with Lee Berger, 2007. He's a famous paleoanthropologist, University of Witwatersrand, South Africa. So he's found the big discoveries over the last decade, Australopithecus sediba and Homo naledi. And so this group had this opportunity to come interview him, and they visited his fossil collection at the university where he's a professor, and they discussed the fossils they're seeing there. So in the article following the interview, Chris Smith, the editor, says, one of the most interesting things that the fossil record reveals is that we went through a period of extreme giantism. These were people routinely over 7 feet tall. They were huge. Berger says, you probably heard the myth that ancient humans were tiny, and some of them were tiny, but as we move through the period of 0.5 million to 300,000 years ago in Africa, they go through a period of giantism. And he proceeds to show the group an example of one of the giant femurs from a species dubbed Homo heidelbergensis. He says they're huge. That's so big, we can't even calculate how big this individual was. You need an NBA basketball player to get someone of the height someone like this would have been, something like over 7 feet tall. So these are huge fossils. They don't even know for sure how big these guys had to have been. He just surmises over 7 feet tall. And so Smith responds to Berger and asks him, is this just some weird abnormality? And Berger says, no, because we found a lot of them. Everywhere we find them enormous. These are what we call archaic Homo sapiens. Some people refer to them as Homo heidelbergensis, right? Guys, I want to just go ahead and give it a different name. Why is he giving them a different name? Because they're huge. These individuals are extraordinary. They are giants, right? So notice, first of all, Berger acknowledges these are humans. They're Homo sapiens. They're just ancient, and they're big. And it's not just an abnormality. There seems to be a race of these guys. And if Homo heidelbergensis isn't big enough for you, back in 1944, Rolf von Koenigswald of the Netherlands Indies Geological Survey found some enormous jawbones. Time magazine ran an article announcing the discovery. Notice the title of the article, Giants in Those Days, quoting from Genesis 6:4. Koenigswald first found a big jawbone which looked more human than Pithecanthropus's, but was so massive that he thought it could not possibly be a man's. Then he found a still larger jaw, the biggest ever discovered, which was unmistakably human. It was apparently the most primitive, truly human fossil ever discovered. Koenigswald named it Meganthropus paleojavanicus, right? You give it a fancy name like that, it makes it seem, I don't know, something. And that wasn't the end. Koenigswald's crowning find dwarfed even Meganthropus. He found 3 astounding teeth. They were 6 times as big as a modern man's molars. Weidenreich is sure from the pattern of their biting surfaces that they are definitely human. And he has named this man monster Gigantanthropus. Franz Weidenreich now believes that gigantism and massiveness may have been a general or at least widespread character of early mankind. So notice evidence of big humans. Now this may not all be talking about like the giants like Goliath. I would suggest that in the ancient world, especially the pre-flood environment, that humans would have been conducive to being larger in a widespread way. Because you already see the animals and plants being larger too. Why not the humans? Which is what Weidenreich seems to be suggesting. Either way, these are post-flood, but this is early post-flood sediment that you're finding some large descendants that are there. It's possible that even one of that Shem, Ham, or Japheth actually could have been larger in this way. Maybe, maybe not. But notice again, we have scientific evidence that verifies the Bible's prediction and helps substantiate the creation model. And if the fossil evidence isn't enough, you can look around today and see examples of some pretty big people. Even though we're thousands of years beyond the optimal period of health and life longevity, when I think of modern day giants, the first person I thought of was the professional wrestler Andre the Giant. Died in 1993. He was only 7 feet 4 inches. He was short compared to the tallest man alive today, Sultan Kosin, 8 feet 3 inches tall. And his immense height seems to have come as a result of a pituitary condition, which resulted in an overproduction of growth hormone. So even know the kind of things that can cause great height. Now, his health is not good, but that is not the case with some of these larger giants like this. There's one from the late 1800s that was able to pick up a horse, and they used him in a circus. According to the Guinness Book of World Records, the tallest man in medical history that has been reliably confirmed was Robert Vodlow, died in 1940, measuring in at 8 feet 11 inches, just shy of 9 feet. Weighed 491 pounds at one point. And so the giants of the Bible are not mythical beings, they are humans, albeit big ones. All right, number 20, if the flood happened, we'd predict that stories from such a cataclysmic event would be preserved as ancient oral traditions or in writings. Okay, so since the flood would have been apparently before the time whenever they were doing a lot of writing, then the stories would have been passed down initially orally, right, by word of mouth. And so you'd expect there to be similarities between the legends, so to speak, but you would expect them not to be the same And likely many distortions would have been made over the millennia as people move further and further away from godly thinking. And sure enough, there's over 250 legends spread out across the world, ancient legends about a great flood. So here's just a few of those. In Greece, Zeus wanted to destroy humans with a flood and start over. Deucalion and his wife were put in a large wooden chest. A flood came that covered almost all the mountain peaks. Babylon, Utnapishtim, is warned by a god to build a boat in preparation for a terrible flood. He covered it with pitch, brought animals of all kinds and provisions. He sent out a dove afterward to see if the flood had receded, then a swallow, then a raven, which didn't return. They left the boat and worshiped their gods after that. The Toltec Indians tell of a great flood that destroyed the first world 1,716 years after creation. That's very similar to the Hebrew text. A few people escaped in a closed chest. When I was in Grand Canyon, I heard about the Anasazi Indians, the ancient Indians from the western U.S. that had a flood story. In China, the Nasu people, God sent a messenger to tell 3 sons of a flood. Dumb listened, ironically, and built a wooden boat. And then a huge flood came and covered the whole earth. Dumb was saved and had 3 sons that repopulated the earth. So notice amazing similarities, and they don't match the Bible perfectly, but if they did match, you'd think there'd been some kind of collusion, right? Because these are being passed down over hundreds of years by word of mouth in some cases. In the books, The Discovery of Genesis and the Mystery Confucius Couldn't Solve, Nelson even argues that the origin of the Chinese word for boat, you'll notice, is comprised of the ancient forms of the words for vessel, 8, and mouth or people. So the word boat means a vessel for 8 people, basically, right? Which would be like the ark, of course. And he makes a case for several other Chinese words being traced back to the flood, to the Tower of Babel, even to creation, and also argues from historical evidence that the Chinese were originally monotheistic. Right? So every society should have begun monotheistic, right? Eventually they would have changed to polytheistic over time. So again, over 250 legends of a major flood, and the resemblances to Scripture in many cases is extremely noteworthy. And just as we would predict to be the case if the flood actually happened. All right, in light of the catastrophic nature of the flood, as well as the drastic change in lifespans after the flood, we'd predict that during and after the flood, for a period of time, there would have probably been evidence of irregular rates or processes that today are constant and slow, like nuclear decay rates, which we already looked at, tectonic plate movement, which there's evidence of that being more rapid too, tree ring growth, ice layer formation, and so forth. And some of this has been discussed. We'll discuss some of that tomorrow morning. So let's move to number 22, evidence that catastrophism, rapid burial from catastrophes rather than uniformitarianism, would explain much of the geologic column, especially the fossils. We would expect that to be uncovered. And we already saw examples of polystrate fossils, but you also have these dinosaur graveyards found all over the world. And whenever I've done some actual dinosaur fossil excavation in Wyoming, where there has been dug up over 30,000 dinosaur fossils there. He thinks there's at least 5,000 animals representative in this one ranch, okay? And so every day they're digging up dozens more. And so there's thousands of these, and these are like T-Rex and Triceratops and Edmontosaurus. They're big, and yet they're in shards. And it is from a single event, and one of the reasons we know that is the bed that they're found in, the fossils are organized by size. Okay, so they get bigger as you go down, which we know when that happens, that is a single event where a lot of material, like a mudslide, is happening, going a long enough distance where by gravity it starts sorting the fossils. So it's what we call a single graded bed. And so this is evidence of a single event which involved a lot of water and had enough power to kill over 5,000 dinosaurs, rip them to shreds, and transport them a long distance. That doesn't sound uniform, and it doesn't sound local, and it doesn't sound small, right? Then you've got these interesting fossils all over the world that show catastrophic burial. Like notice This is called an aspiration fossil, where a fossil fish is caught, in the middle of its dinner, that kind of thing. How about this one? This is an ichthyosaur, and it's in the middle of giving birth whenever it gets hit. So this is not uniform kind of conditions. Dinosaurs, you usually don't find their entire body fossilized. You find isolated bones, or like I said, in my work in Wyoming, they're shredded into bits and pieces. But if you happen to find an articulated skeleton where you've got the animal there and the bones are in the position that they died in, it is not uncommon to find them in this posture, where their tail is thrown up, their head's pulled back. A lot of times their mouth is open as though they're gasping for air. And this is known as the opisthontonic death posture. And it's understood to be due to death by water, like drowning. And again, that is a common thing to find with the dinosaurs if you find them articulated. Numbers 23 through 26 concern the fossil record. We would expect the fossil record to reveal fully functional, distinct creatures when they first appear in the fossil record because they didn't evolve. Number 24, the fossil record should reflect, we would say, the progression of the flood. The flood is not a record of life over time. It's a record of death in the flood. Okay, so we'd interpret the fossil record totally different. And so we would find lots of fossil anomalies to evolutionary thinking that don't fit with the evolutionary timeline. And these fossil graveyards, we would expect those to be found. So this is number 23. This has been verified beyond a doubt in the fossil record. It's even conceded they don't have an explanation for this. Like Darwin recognized, for example, the Cambrian explosion, which I already talked about, remember, as a major problem for evolution. Like the fossil record explodes onto the scene. They're already fully formed and functional creatures without evolutionary history. Stephen Jay Gould is probably the leading paleontologist of the 20th century, Harvard paleontologist. He had no explanation for it, spent his life trying to get an explanation, died not having one. They have no explanation for how to harmonize the fossil record with evolution. And so notice, for example, what Richard Dawkins says about this problem. All right, probably the leading evolutionary biologist, Oxford University. The Cambrian strata of rocks, vintage about 600 million years, are the oldest in which we find most of the major invertebrate groups, and we find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution the very first time they appear. It's as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Needless to say, this appearance of sudden planting has delighted creationists. Well, why would that be? Well, because that's exactly what we'd predict. The fossil record perfectly fits like what we would expect. It's a major problem, the evolutionary model. I've got a more in-depth article on this on our website, and I have a video that's 10 or 11 minutes long talking more about this. But not good for the evolutionary model, but it's perfectly in harmony with what we would predict to be the case. Numbers 24 and 25 on that list, evolutionary theory would predict that the lower strata should be simpler creatures, closer to the single-celled organism that supposedly everything came from. Okay, and then they should get more complex as you go up. Now at the very bottom, at the Cambrian strata, are the trilobites. They show up. And so they should be very simple, right? Because they're right down there at the bottom. Now Bill Nye, in his debate with Ken Ham, he even argued that you never see like higher, more complex organisms mixing with the lower organisms. And if you did, you'd change the world because you disprove evolution. So the trilobite, right off the bat, it's not a lower animal. It's not simple. It's considered one of the first creatures to show up, and so it should be simple, but it's extremely complex. The eye of the trilobite has an aplanatic lens, dual lenses, as opposed to the human eye, which has a single refractive lens. And so scientists acknowledge the design of the trilobite eye is even better than our own. And yet again, it shows up at the very bottom. This guy is able to see on the bottom of the ocean where he's at, like in murky water and stuff. This is already a problem for evolution. How does this guy show up right off the bat? You've also got some other interesting examples um, like of what appears to be higher and lower animals mixing, artifacts that have been found that, man, is this what it seems to be? Very controversial, to say the least. And many would brush examples like this aside, but just as one example, consider what's called the Meister footprint. What does it appear to be to you? I mean, it's argued to be a fossilized sandal print, and it's been analyzed pretty strongly by some creationists. But notice what's in it. Okay, it has a trilobite in it. And so it just can't be what it seems to be, right? Maybe it's not a sandal print. That's possible, but we'd be able to explain that. Evolutionists wouldn't. We found human-like footprints in coal veins that are supposed to have been laid down 248 million years before humans were around. We have a pickaxe encased in sediment that's supposed to be 65 million years old, so 63 million years before humans were supposed to be around. And yet there's a pickaxe in Cretaceous sediment. How about the fossil of a mammal with a dinosaur in its stomach cavity? Mammals aren't supposed to be around that are this big with the dinosaurs yet. They don't show up until the Cenozoic. Or the existence of so-called living fossils like the coelacanth. Creatures that were thought to be ancient, extinct creatures. You find them lower in the fossil record and then they disappear from the fossil record as though they're dead and gone. And then all of a sudden, some guys are fishing and pull one up. And it's a coelacanth, and it hasn't changed in supposedly millions of years. Okay, so this proves that, number one, evolution didn't happen. And number two, just because you don't see fossils in intervening layers, it doesn't mean those creatures didn't exist then, right? Just because you don't see humans in the fossils in the Paleozoic and Mesozoic doesn't mean humans weren't there. Other things can be going on. That doesn't mean they weren't alive then. Now, while the evolutionary model struggles with these kind of anomalies because they very patently contradict evolution, these are the kind of things that be predicted by us. We would argue that just because something's lower doesn't necessarily mean it's more primitive. All kinds were created fully functional and perfect in the beginning. So you'd expect a diversity of simplicity and complexity everywhere from the beginning. Whether or not a fossil is found lower is going to be due to other factors, namely when it was buried in the flood. So in general, we would say the fossil record is reflecting the progress of the flood. Okay, so when the flood starts, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth. The first creatures that are going to get hit are ocean floor creatures. Guess what shows up in the fossil record first? Ocean floor creatures. Then the flood progresses. It starts hitting the fish, as you'd expect. Then it gets towards the coast, and so it starts hitting coastal creatures like the amphibians. And then it starts moving on to land. It hits the reptiles. Right? And then it starts finally picking up some of the mammals and birds. So the fossil record is a reflection of the death in the flood by habitat. They're being wiped out sequentially. And so it fits. Now, interestingly, when the fish show up, they stay in all the ones above it, even in the middle of the continents, right? And they don't show up first because they're not down on the ocean floor with the ocean floor critters. Number 26, fossil graveyards are clear examples of places where herds of animals were caught and unable to escape. Some kind of cataclysmic fossil forming event. They're found all over the world. And again, I already showed you one in Wyoming. All right, number 27, we'd expect, sedimentary rock is formed from bodies of water. Okay, so if the flood occurred, you'd expect sedimentary rock to be found prevalently in all those layers of the flood. Sure enough, of course they are. They're the most common rocks exposed on the surface of the earth. They make up 75% of the surface rocks. They're even on mountains. Seismites, I talked about seismites and what we're finding out there in Wyoming, which remember these are rock layers that are formed whenever you have an earthquake vibrating a layer of sandstone, a layer of sand that has water in it, and then when it turns to sandstone, you see the evidence of it being shaken up from the water and so forth. And I mentioned to you that the seismites we're finding in Wyoming, look at how big these mamas are. These are big seismites. These aren't just inches thick. These are 15 feet or more. So this is proof of large amounts of water in Wyoming, okay, and proof of enormous, never heard of earthquakes, okay. So these would have, again, probably been the earthquakes occurring due to the Pacific Ocean plate smashing into the west coast of the U.S., forming the mountain ranges like the Rockies that are out that way. 29 and 30, if the creation model is true and the incident of the Tower of Babel is true, you'd expect there to be evidence that that event happened too. Just like we expect historical evidence from stories passed down through the millennia in the case of the flood, as well as in the case of the dinosaurs. We find it with the dinosaurs too. But we'd also expect it in the case of Babel. So recall the flood legend of the Toltec Indians and the legend after the survivors left the chest in the flood. They wandered the earth until they found a place to build a zakwali, a high tower, in case another flood came. And during that time period, their languages are confused and they spread out over the earth. In China, the Miaotzu people have a flood legend where it poured for 40 days, and then there were 55 days of drizzle, and the flood covered the mountain ranges. Nuwa and his family and animals were saved in a wide boat. A bird was sent out, sacrifices made. Then the survivors made cities and spoke the same language, built a very high tower, which was wrong. God came and mixed their language. They didn't finish building the city. They were separated over the earth. Dan Landis documents a lot of examples. In the Burmese legend, the people built a pagoda to try to reach the heavens, and then their God came down angrily and confused their languages and caused them to spread out. In the Congo, instead of building a tower, they balanced themselves on long poles. In the Mexican version, they built a tower out of clay. In India, it was demons, and they built an altar to the sky and were thwarted by the sky god. Africa, Greece, the Assam people, many have a story about this structure being built into the sky and the languages being confused so that the people had to be spread out. And as with the flood legends, the details don't match, but we wouldn't expect them to, because these traditions are probably being passed down orally for centuries. And if they did match, you'd assume there was some kind of collusion. But this common thread of an ancient incident involving a god, a tall structure, the confusion of languages, this is a common theme that would be predicted based on the flood model. We'll cover number 30 in our last prediction in our session tomorrow. So, the creation model is not scientific. It cannot make verifiable predictions. It's silliness, and I don't even know why you're here. So, anyway. Bottom line, Bill Nye, the pseudoscience guy, doesn't know what he is talking about. Let's see here. We've got a lot of materials video-wise on our website. Be sure to check that out. We're not really doing DVDs anymore, so all of this is available for free on our website. Tons and tons of digital materials, and we've been putting out a ton also of short videos as well as these longer series that can be great for Bible classes, that sort of thing. Science versus Evolution, this is kind of an abbreviated form of the evolution seminar I do. Is Genesis History, that's not an AP product, but I highly recommend that. Dismantling Evolution, these are Brotherhood scientists. Dismantling Evolution and Building Creation in one weekend. The video series, though, we got a ton of these and a lot of short videos that are, say, 3 to 7, 8 minutes, dozens and dozens of these that can be great to share on your social media and so forth, let other people know about those. And I was talking about how young people and how evangelism is, they're kind of the front lines of evangelism, and I like the idea of equipping them with what they need to talk to their friends. And so I made a list of like 250 passages that I think would be good for young people to know and know how to use. And so at our congregation, I have something called Kids Prep, where on Sunday nights we take a few minutes before worship and we just work on memory work. And the congregation is there too. And I've got songs where they can memorize all of these memory verses to song to make it a lot easier to recall. So that's what these CDs are. All right, so in our session tomorrow, hopefully everybody's been again thinking about questions that you might have, and if you're not going to be here tomorrow, then you can always come and ask me questions before we leave today. But tomorrow morning, we're going to look at several specific other points that Bill Nye brought up that I thought were great arguments that we need to be ready to deal with. And then in our session during the worship hour, we're going to answer the question, why would a person want to be a Christian? Why would you even want to do that? Because that's really that's the problem. You know, that's why most people don't want to become a Christian, because they think it's going to be, make them not happy in some way. The denial they'll have to do or whatever. So we'll look at some arguments for why a person would want to become a Christian. Then we'll have our Q&A after lunch tomorrow. Okay, wish we had more time to cover more of those predictions, but we are out of time. And David, I'm handing it over to you. Thank you again for your attention today.